Yeah, Atriox is cool and all, but that Craig guy, oh man, I would not mess with that dude. If I crash landed on his Halo ring, I would not want to mess with his forces on the ground. Atriox, he's just a fat guy who kinda really needs a leg day, so
Ultimate Halo.
Hey up lads and lasses, Fletch here from Ultimate Halo. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are nearly at 90,000 subscribers, so you know what to do. Help a Halo YouTuber out, and I promise at the end of November I will get rid of this damn horrible mustache, I promise. So recently I've been doing some reading, and to be honest with you, I haven't finished the book yet, but I practically know what happens. And Halo The Shadows of Reach is a really great read. The characters are fantastic, and Troy Denning does a brilliant job in characterizing Blue Team. It's something he does incredibly well in all of his books. But we still don't know exactly what it is they recovered from Castle Base for Dr. Halsey, and that's not necessarily a problem as such, and we've all got a pretty good idea that it's probably another Matrix or clone of Halsey, flash clone of Halsey's brain, so we can make a new Cortana model, which is very much what it's looking like, especially with all the evidence provided in Halo Infinite. But there is something I want to draw your attention to, and the Banished are a really great faction, but we don't necessarily know what their intentions are exactly just yet. We know they want power in the galaxy, we know they probably want a lot of money, a lot of equipment, a lot of military gear, and particularly Foreigner, because they've shown a great deal of interest in that, hence the reason why they're on the Ark in the first place, as well as who in the hell are the Harbinger. Now I've got something coming on that shortly in another video, but one thing I've realised about the Banished is that they don't necessarily look like the Banished and how they traditionally are, and there are some very good reasons both from a gameplay and a lore perspective I think this is the case. Now in Halo Wars 2 you can see that they're primarily grey, black or red, or a mixture of all of those colours. Now from a gameplay perspective that's not particularly interesting, so gameplay wise it does allow players to identify who's what, who's a minor, who's a major, you know, who's strong and who's not. So basically you could go up into a character in Halo 3, you knew who was strong by the colour of their armour, and that's been universal across all Halo games, and for an accessibility standpoint that makes a lot of sense, especially with Halo trying to get a lot more new players in with it being a spiritual reboot. On the note of it also being a spiritual reboot, it's also a really great idea that all of these enemies kind of look like the traditional Covenant, because the thing is, we don't want to start something completely new. Everybody likes the Covenant. There's a reason why they worked in the first place. And don't get me wrong, I really enjoy the Banished, but I'm not sure if I'd be on board with the entirety of their aesthetic being pulled over. But then as I sat down and started to write the script for this video, I did notice something. And I watched the gameplay trailer like I've done 10 million times probably already, nitpicking at every little thing I can find just for scraps to make in a video. And the red Banished, those in red armour, they only ever come out when there's a big event happening. Every other piece of the Banished, with the exception of some elites, but I'll get into that in a moment, they drop in from the sky. So these are obviously higher ranking brutes compared to the blue ones and the purple ones we saw earlier. So it's clear that in Halo Infinite, to some degree, only the red Banished, the traditional Banished who are going to be stronger bosses, I'm assuming, are going to drop in at key points. This makes you know that there's going to be a boss section or this is an important part of a mission. Whereas all the other forces were already stationed there anyway, so that kind of doesn't make a difference. And in terms of the elites, they've always had a red rank, so it doesn't necessarily matter in that sense. They might not be your traditional Banished as you come to think of them. So for all you lore kids out there, you probably sat there thinking, okay, yeah, this is all well and good, but why? Well, the reason is, if you haven't read Halo Shadows of Reach, you wouldn't know that the Keepers of the One Freedom are now joined in alliance with the Banished, and this is most likely out of necessity. Now, for those who don't know who the Keepers of the One Freedom are, it was a splinter group that was formed not long after the Great Schism, after the Covenant fell in their civil war, and they still believe in the Great Journey, the ideals that the prophets set out from their beliefs of the Foreigners, which is obviously false, and they still to this day probably don't believe that Halo rings are weapons, and interestingly enough, they work with humans quite a lot, and there are lots of humans within their ranks, so stability and civility between these groups will likely be at an all-time low because they're working with the Banished, and the Banished have clearly wiped out a lot of humanity from what we see in part of the Halo Infinite gameplay trailer. So I suspect a lot of the assets used by the keepers of One Freedom are what we see on screen. Now there is one plot hole in that, is that one of the brutes does shout, but I suppose at the same time, this brute could still be part of the keepers of the One Freedom and still say such things. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, they could be forced to say that because they don't necessarily have a choice. Everyone is kind of desperate in the universe at the moment. Cortana has everybody back up against the wall, except for the Banished, clearly, who seem to be holding their own. So really, you need to take alliances, or you stand no chance of going at it alone. So will the keepers actually play a role in the story of Halo Infinite? I don't think so, at least not from a main plot narrative perspective. They may be in audio logs. I think that'll be a really good way to discuss their story, but on the whole, no, and I think that's probably for the best because accessibility, we don't want to have to read too many books to understand what these characters and factions are all about. So, what do you think? Do you think this is a good theory? Do you think I'm right? Do you think this is if this was to be true, is it a good idea to go down with? I think yeah, because from a visual perspective, I don't want everything to be red and grey. Whilst it works really well in Halo Wars 2, maybe from a Halo FPS standpoint, it's not the best of ideas. But once again, my name is Jack Fletcher. A sub to 90k would be pretty awesome, and I will see you next time on the one and the only Ultimate Halo.
Subscribe now to Ultimate Halo for more unfriggin' believable Halo content.